Hello everyone. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than words. When a familiar face disappears, it leaves behind not just memories, but a deep ache in the hearts of those left behind. Some stories are too powerful to forget. Stories that shaped lives, inspired millions, and echoed across generations. Today we take a moment to remember, to reflect, and to honor a soul whose presence may be gone, but whose legacy lives on.
Bridget Anderson arrived like a comet, bright, beautiful, and impossibly brief. Born on July 11, 1975, in Inglewood, California, she wasn't merely a child actor. She was a child wonder. From her earliest years, she radiated the kind of poise and emotional depth that few seasoned performers could command. There was a spark in her eyes, a confidence in her voice that defied her age. And when the world first saw her, it didn't just see a girl playing pretend. It saw someone who truly understood what it meant to feel. Her story began like many in Hollywood. A precocious child, bright and inquisitive, memorizing stories before she could even read, reciting Shakespeare at an age when most children were still struggling with their ABCs. Her parents noticed this early brilliance and enrolled her in modeling and commercials. It wasn't long before casting directors realized what they had, a child who could not only follow direction, but bring an emotional weight to her roles that felt lived in and real. Bridget's breakout came in 1982 with the television movie Savannah Smiles, in which she played a young girl who runs away from her affluent but neglectful home and is taken in by two small-time criminals. The film was sweet, funny, and touching, but was Bridget who gave it its heart. Her performance was astonishing, not simply because she was so young, but because she made Savannah's loneliness, hope, and joy feel absolutely genuine. She wasn't acting. She was inhabiting. Critics were stunned. Audiences were moved. In Bridget, they saw something special, not just a gifted child performer, but a rare soul. Hollywood took notice. In the years that followed, she appeared in various television shows and films, Fantasy Island, Remington Steele, Gun-Shy, and became one of the most sought-after young actresses of her time. But more than the roles she played, it was the depth she brought to them that lingered. Yet for all her talent, Bridget was navigating an industry notorious for how it handles its youngest stars. The brightness of early fame often casts long shadows, and the transitions between childhood adoration and adult anonymity are rarely kind. As she grew older, the roles became fewer, the attention dimmer. The world that once embraced her moved on, as it so often does, in search of the next bright face. Bridget tried to find her place in a world that had stopped asking for her. She reportedly battled with personal struggles, disappointment, identity, perhaps addiction, realities that are heartbreakingly common among child stars whose gifts were celebrated too early and then forgotten too soon. The applause faded, but the ache remained. On May 18, 1997, Bridget Anderson died of an accidental overdose. She was just 21 years old. Her death was quiet, unnoticed by many, a tragic coda to a life that had once shone so brightly. But for those who remembered Savannah Smiles, who saw her brief rise and felt her unique screen presence, the loss was immense. Bridget's legacy is not one of long careers or golden statues. It's a legacy of a single, unforgettable performance that captured the heart of a generation. It's a legacy of innocence, of raw emotion, of a child who seemed to know more about life than most adults around her. She showed us what it meant to be vulnerable, to be hopeful, to be truly seen. In her short time, she reminded the world that greatness isn't measured in years, but in impact. And for those few magical moments on screen, Bridget Anderson gave us something timeless, true through the eyes of a child. Charles Grodin was never the loudest man in the room, but he was almost always the funniest. His comedy wasn't the kind that chased attention. It was the kind that quietly unfolded, often in bewildered silences, subtle eye rolls, or exquisitely deadpan retorts. Groden was a master of restraint, a connoisseur of awkward timing, and one of the few performers who could make exasperation feel like an art form. For decades, he crafted a distinct comic persona that stood apart from the wild antics of his peers, a persona defined by gentle sarcasm, a perpetually furrowed brow, and a perpetual sense of why me. Born on April 21, 1935, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Charles Sidney Grodin came into a world that hadn't yet made room for his particular style of comedy. The son of Orthodox Jewish merchants, Groden grew up immersed in a culture of diligence, conversation, and wit. But even from a young age, he sensed that he wasn't built for convention. He enrolled at the University of Miami, but soon abandoned the classroom for the stage. New York City beckoned, and Grodin answered, studying acting under the formidable Uta Hagen at the HB studio. He absorbed the rigor of the craft, not to become a method actor, but to become an honest one. His early career, like many actors, was a patchwork of television appearances and minor roles. In 1962, he had a small part in Sex and the College Girl. His work was quiet, dependable, but for years, he hovered just outside of fame's spotlight. It wasn't until his brief, iconic appearance in Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby in 1968 that casting directors began to take notice. But Groden wasn't rushing towards stardom. He was patient, choosing projects that allowed him to shape his peculiar comedic timing. The breakthrough came in 1972 with The Heartbreak Kid, a film directed by Elaine May that would come to define his early career. In it, Groden played Lenny Cantrell, a newlywed who, while on his honeymoon, decides he's made a terrible mistake and falls in love with another woman. The role was bold, risky. Lenny was selfish, manipulative, almost sociopathic, and yet Groden played him with such bland charm and guileless narcissism that audiences were compelled to watch. His performance turned emotional discomfort into high art. Critics took notice, and Groden was suddenly a name people remembered. From there, he carved out a niche that few could touch. In Heaven Can Wait, Seems Like Old Times, The Lonely Guy, and Ishtar, Groden honed his image, the bemused everyman, often trapped in absurd situations, responding with equal parts disbelief and resignation. He was the straight man in a world gone mad, and his humor lay not in punchlines, but in the pauses before them. But perhaps his finest moment on film came with Midnight Run, 1988, a buddy action comedy that paired him with Robert De Niro. Groden played Jonathan Mardukas, a neurotic accountant on the run from a mob. De Niro was the gruff bounty hunter assigned to bring him in. What should have been a standard odd couple pairing became a near-perfect balance of tension and tenderness, sarcasm and sincerity. Groden's performance was deceptively intricate. He was irritating and endearing all at once, the emotional counterbalance to De Niro's toughness. Together, they created a classic. The film became a sleeper hit, and Groden's reputation as a singular comedic talent was sealed. In the 1990s, Groden took an unexpected turn into family films, starring in the wildly popular Beethoven series. As the exasperated father in a household overwhelmed by a slobbering St. Bernard, Groden brought a rare authenticity to what could have been forgettable slapstick. Kids laughed at the dog. Adults laughed at Groden's simmering frustration. He wasn't phoning it in, he was elevating it. Away from the camera, Groden explored other facets of his creativity. He wrote plays, essays, and memoirs. His books were dry, self-effacing, and insightful, much like the man himself. Titles like It Would Be So Nice If You Weren't Here and How I Got to Be Whoever It Is, I am revealed a deep thinker behind the deadpan delivery, a man who saw through the glitter of Hollywood but remained fascinated by it. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Groden became a talk show staple, not just as a guest but as a commentator and host. His frequent appearances on Late Night with David Letterman became legendary. He and Letterman developed a strange, antagonistic rapport that was part performance, part reality. Groden would come on, pretend to be irritated or underprepared, and end up stealing the show. It was performance art disguised as awkward banter. Groden's faux grumpy demeanor played perfectly against Letterman's own wryness, and their segments became cult classics. But Groden also used his voice for more serious matters. In his later years, he became a political commentator and advocate for criminal justice reform. He testified before Congress, worked with inmates, and wrote about prison issues with clarity and compassion. It was a side of Groden that the public rarely saw, passionate, idealistic, determined to leave the world a little better than he found it. Even as his film roles dwindled in the 2000s, Groden never fully left the stage. He returned to Broadway, acted in select roles, and maintained a steady presence in television. He was a performer of principle, never chasing fame but always pursuing meaning in his work. He seemed content in the background, never desperate for the spotlight but always unforgettable when it found him. Charles Grodin passed away on May 18, 2021, from bone marrow cancer. The news rippled quietly, just as he might have preferred. But those who understood his genius felt the loss deeply. He wasn't a bombastic star or a media magnet. He was something rarer, a craftsman of comedy, a philosopher of discomfort, a man whose silences spoke louder than most monologues. In a career that spanned over 5 decades, Groden gave us an alternative to the manic energy of traditional comedy. He reminded us that humor lives in stillness, that discomfort can be hilarious, and that sometimes saying less says everything. His legacy isn't written in blockbuster numbers or Oscar trophies. It's etched in wry smiles and slow burns, in the art of not trying too hard. He was, in the end, a thinking man's comedian, a reluctant celebrity, a master of the quiet storm. And in the pantheon of American performers, there will always be a seat, slightly off to the side, looking unimpressed but deeply engaged, reserved for Charles Grodin. In the brooding tapestry of modern rock, few voices cut deeper than that of Chris Cornell. It was a voice that didn't simply sing. It roared, wept, ascended, and collapsed. It was elemental. The kind of voice that, once heard, seemed as though it had always existed, etched in stone, whispered in wind, forged in fire. But beyond the octave-stretching screams and haunting falsettos, Chris Cornell was more than a frontman. He was a poet of despair and redemption, a craftsman of melody, and a reluctant icon of a generation forever suspended between rebellion and ruin. Born on July 20th, 1964, in Seattle, Washington, Cornell came of age in a city known more for its rain than its music, until the 1990s. His early life was marked by struggle and solitude. He battled depression from a young age, retreating into music like it was oxygen. It was in the privacy of that internal world that he discovered the sacred refuge of sound. He learned to play drums first, then guitar, but it was his voice, towering, aching, defiant, that became his truest instrument. In 1984, he formed Soundgarden with guitarist Kim Thale and bassist Hiro Yamamoto. At first, the band was a chaotic experiment, a meeting point between punk ferocity and metal density. But Cornell gave it soul. Soundgarden would go on to become one of the foundational pillars of the grunge movement, long before that term was being sold on flannel shirts and MTV countdowns. They were raw, dangerous, and intellectually fearless. Albums like Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown weren't just hits, they were sonic earthquakes. Songs like Rusty Cage, Fell on Black Days, and Black Hole Sun captured the emotional vertigo of a disaffected generation. Cornell's lyrics were introspective and mythic, exploring themes of isolation, spiritual decay, and the search for transcendence. His presence was magnetic. On stage, Cornell was wiry and electric, coiled like a spring, always one breath away from eruption. Off stage, he was thoughtful, soft-spoken, and known for his intense introspection. His duality became part of his mystique, rock god and gentle philosopher wrapped in the same frame. When Soundgarden disbanded in 1997, at the height of their powers, Cornell didn't retreat. Instead, he expanded. He released a solo album, Euphoria Morning, in 1999. Though it didn't achieve the commercial success of his grunge days, it was a rich and intimate collection that offered a different side of his artistry. The album shimmered with aching vulnerability, and songs like Can't Change Me showcased a man wrestling with identity, addiction, and the fragility of love. Then came Audioslave. Formed in 2001 with members of Rage Against the Machine, the band fused Cornell's haunting vocal melodies with explosive instrumentation. Audioslave wasn't just a supergroup, it was a rebirth. With tracks like a Stone, Show Me How to Live, and I'm the Highway, the band reached an entirely new generation of listeners. Cornell, older now, sang with both clarity and weariness. He sounded like a man who had walked through fire and learned to sing about the ashes. Yet despite success, darkness remained. Cornell struggled for years with substance abuse, depression, and the burdens of fame. But he never allowed those battles to define him. Instead, he used them as creative fuel. His 2007 album, Carry On, and 2009 Scream found him experimenting again, unafraid to alienate, unafraid to fail. He explored everything from stripped-down acoustic ballads to electronic beats. Always curious, always pushing. In his later years, he returned to solo work and reunited with Soundgarden, reclaiming their legacy with tours and a final album, King Animal. His performances during this period were electric, filled with both nostalgia and mastery. He also took to the stage with just an acoustic guitar, reinterpreting his own catalog and paying tribute to others. These shows stripped away the walls, leaving just the man and his voice, raw, luminous, undeniable. Outside of music, Cornell was deeply committed to philanthropy. He and his wife Vicky created the Chris and Vicky Cornell Foundation, aimed at protecting vulnerable children and addressing the cycles of poverty and abuse. His empathy ran deep. He knew what it was to suffer in silence, and he tried to use his platform to be a voice for those without one. On May 18, 2017, Chris Cornell was found dead in his hotel room in Detroit, just hours after performing with Soundgarden. The cause was ruled suicide by hanging. The news shattered millions. It was as if a great bell had fallen from the tower. His death sent ripples through not just the rock community, but through anyone who had ever felt less alone because of his music. The irony was cruel. He had been the voice that comforted so many in their darkest hours, and yet his own pain remained unrelenting. In the aftermath, tributes poured in. Fans gathered in cities across the world, lighting candles and playing his songs into the night. Musicians spoke of his brilliance and humility. His children remembered a father who tucked them in with lullabies and made pancakes in the morning. For all his public grandeur, it was his quiet kindness that left the deepest mark on those who knew him personally. Chris Cornell's legacy is not just a matter of record sales or accolades. It's spiritual. It lives in the strange alchemy of pain and beauty that defined his songs. It lives in the teenagers still discovering super unknown, in the tired eyes finding solace in Like a Stone, in the long silences that follow one of his acoustic performances. It lives in the space where sorrow meets strength, where defiance meets grace. He was not perfect. He was not invincible. But he was real. A man who dared to speak the unspeakable, to reach for light in the deepest shadows. A voice for the broken. A poet for the quiet storm. And in the end, he was the highway, long, winding, never quite where you expect it to go, but always leading somewhere deeper, somewhere truer. In the annals of American greatness, there are names that shimmer across more than one arena, individuals who seem sculpted by a higher order of ambition, discipline, and sheer will. Jim Brown was such a man, a titan not only on the football field, but also in film, activism, and the corridors of social change. He was a rare convergence of athletic prowess and moral firepower. To recount Jim Brown's life is to touch on the American century itself, from the rigid fields of racial injustice to the bright lights of Hollywood, from bone-rattling touchdowns to bold stands for civil rights. James Nathaniel Brown was born on February 17, 1936, on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, a place where segregation wasn't just custom, it was law. Raised by a single mother, he moved to Long Island, New York, at a young age, where his talents began to bloom in the fertile soil of competitive sports. Even as a boy, Jim Brown defied limits. He played football, basketball, lacrosse, ran track, and in each, he wasn't just good, he was mythic. At Manhasset High School, his exploits would earn him statewide attention, setting the stage for a collegiate career at Syracuse University that would cement his legend. At Syracuse, Brown was an unstoppable force. On the football field, he punished defenders with a combination of speed, power, and grace that seemed to contradict itself. He averaged over 6 yards per carry his senior season and scored 6 touchdowns in a single game against Colgate. But it wasn't only football. He was also a star in basketball and, most notably, lacrosse, a sport in which he was so dominant that rules were later changed in response to his playing style. Jim Brown was not an athlete. He was a revolution in cleats. When he entered the National Football League in 1957 as a fullback for the Cleveland Browns, the league and the world was not ready for him. He was poetry in motion and fury in collision. For 9 seasons, he dominated in ways still untouched by time. He led the league in rushing yards in 8 of those 9 years. He scored at will. He shed tacklers like a man brushing off cobwebs. Every time he touched the ball, it was as if the laws of physics bent slightly in his favor. But greatness for Jim Brown was not a finish line. It was a launching pad. At the height of his power, just 29 years old, he shocked the sports world by retiring from football in 1966. The decision wasn't rash, it was purposeful. Hollywood had beckoned, and Brown, never one to live inside boundaries, answered. He would go on to star in dozens of films, becoming one of the first black action heroes in American cinema. His roles in films like The Dirty Dozen, 3 the Hard Way, and 100 Rifles, in which he famously shared one of Hollywood's earliest interracial love scenes, were more than performances. They were acts of defiance in a segregated cultural landscape. In Hollywood, as on the field, Jim Brown refused to be cast as anything less than powerful. Yet for all his fame in sports and film, it was his role as a civil rights activist that perhaps revealed the deepest core of the man. In 1967, at the Cleveland Summit, Brown gathered some of the most prominent black athletes of the era, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lew Alcindor, and Muhammad Ali, to support Ali's stand against the Vietnam War draft. It was a historic moment of black solidarity in sports, and Brown was its architect. He wasn't afraid to put reputation and livelihood on the line in the service of justice. His activism didn't end with a single event. It was a lifelong dedication. In the 1980s, Brown founded the American program, a nonprofit devoted to empowering inner-city youth and former gang members through life management skills. It was hands-on, street-level work. He wasn't interested in photo ops or symbolic gestures. He sat with men society had discarded. He taught, listened, demanded better. He believed in redemption because he knew what it was to be misunderstood, judged, and underestimated. Indeed, Brown's life wasn't without controversy. He faced legal troubles, allegations of violence, and public criticism over the years. But even in these moments, his legacy was complex, not undone. He was never perfect, but he was always unapologetically real. In a country hungry for heroes and quick to discard them, Brown stood tall, complicated, complete. As the decades pass, Jim Brown remained a towering figure in American life. When he spoke, presidents listened. When he walked into a room, athletes stood taller. His name was etched in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and his number 32 jersey became sacred in Cleveland. But more than the statistics, though they were staggering, it was the soul he brought to each chapter of his life that set him apart. Whether stiff-arming linebackers, holding a protest sign, or mentoring a troubled teen, Brown carried with him an unshakable belief in human potential. He lived long enough to see the fruits of his efforts ripple across generations. The athlete-activists of today, Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, Serena Williams, owe part of their platform to the trail Brown blazed. He taught that silence was complicity, that power was not just to be held, but wielded for good, that to be black, gifted, and unafraid in America was itself a revolutionary act. Jim Brown passed away on May 18, 2023, at the age of 87. His death marked the close of an extraordinary chapter in American life, but not the end of his story. He lives on in highlight reels and civil rights textbooks, in the swagger of young athletes who understand they are more than just players. In every arena he entered, he demanded more, not just of others, but of himself. And in doing so, he became something larger than life. Jim Brown was not a man easily defined. He was a son of the segregated South, a conqueror of Sundays, a face on a silver screen, and a foot soldier in the fight for equality. He moved between worlds with grace and force, breaking barriers simply by refusing to acknowledge they had a right to exist. He wasn't just great at what he did. He reshaped what was possible in every field he touched. And that is how legends are made, not by what they achieve, but by what they awaken in the hearts of others. In their memory. Though they are no longer with us, their contributions to music, entertainment, and culture continue to inspire and shape the world today. Their legacies live on, reminding us of the impact one can leave behind. Thank you for watching. RIP Daily Update.